let me start off by sort of characterizing what we mean by development. Development starts at the vision, right? And it's a process that takes us all the way up to the beginning of construction. That's the development time frame that we're referencing. After that, it's the construction time frame, and that's construction is what it is. I think most of us understand that. So the next few slides, we're going to be addressing each one of those steps one by one. There's going to be a primary focus. You will hear overtones of cost establishment and cost control in more or less every one of these single steps. We believe it is the most vital aspect of a project, right? So that we can have vision, we can have needs and desires, but without the funding, construction it's very difficult to do construction without funding. So that's predominantly what Billy and I are going to talk about today. We're also going to use King of Glory Church as a case study. Henderson has been fortunate enough to have a relationship with King of Glory Church for approximately 8 years now. Starting back in mid-2018, we were introduced to the church, and I think most of you heard that RFP process. The church issued an RFQ for several construction managers. We responded to that. We were selected to work with them on their first phase of expansion, which we're sitting in part of that right now. Most of us came through the main entrance. Some of us have seen the new sanctuary. This was an existing portion of the building that received some pretty major modifications, as well as other aspects of the building. That was our first experience in 2020-21 with the church. Since then, we are currently finished up our third phase of construction for the church. So we're going to use that last phase of construction, which was a very simple, and Billy, we can turn, I'm sorry, if we go back to the King of Glory case study. Pretty simple little project, but it followed these forthcoming steps to a T. This was an additional classroom that the church needed. It was about 7,000 square foot. We started working with the church in November of 2023, and we concluded that process of pre-construction with them in November of 2025. So that's a long time period. That was 15 months of development. The construction time frame was March through December of 2025. That was 9 months. So we literally spent more time planning for the construction than the construction took. And that's not atypical, but it's a small project like that. It's about on par. Billy, you want to talk a little bit about some of those percentages?
Sure. During that, we hit a change order rate of 3% on that project for King of Glory. The typical standard on a CMR at risk is anywhere from 5 to 12%. Just wanted to point that out.
So let's start. Step one, right? And step one is almost exclusively the church's responsibility. It is identifying the need and defining the vision, right? So for many of you, you may be in this position right now where there could be some aspect of your existing facility that is, I'll say inadequate. It may be too small. It may be outdated. It may need to be converted for a different use. But that's really identifying the need, right? And then defining the vision. What does it look like from your perspective to resolve that need, right? And oftentimes, and the reason we're here today is to talk about, oftentimes it does translate into new construction or renovation, something of that nature. But just please know that is the first, that's really the ignition to the development process.
The moment that vision is formed, it needs to be tested continually throughout the project. Site realities, you need to explore all those against the budget and against the timeline. So throughout that process, you're just reiterating and refollowing those steps to work through that funding vision. Excuse me, the funding validation. So what the key to this thing is to come up to what you can expend on this project. What is your funding approval amount for this project? You work with your congregation to come up with what you think your preliminary budget's going to be, and you develop that budget. And as you set that budget, you begin to build your team.
Yeah, you will hear repetitively through these next couple of steps about validating the budget. It is a continuing process to, number one, and I don't want this early process to be confused. We're not indicating that you need to know exactly how much money that it's going to take to develop the project at this stage. The primary thing at this stage is just to establish that the project is fundable. Right? So it's starting to have early conversations with your lending institution, the local banks, whoever it may be, to just validate that the vision has some sort of funding or the ability to fund itself. With King of Glory, it was actually, the last phase of King of Glory was actually, we were pretty fortunate. The church committee, the church construction committee, I should say, actually had a person on board that had some finance history, some finance part of his career. And he was able to determine very early on, relatively quickly, that their vision for this 7,000 square foot preschool expansion was a green light. It was fundable to a certain amount.
So this is when we assemble the core team. So you start to bring in your architect. This architect's going to help you begin the process of programming so you can understand the size and space of your building requirements. Once you get that space plan and that preliminary layout of that, you can start to bring in your contractor as well. But once you have your architect and contractor in place, they can start to reiterate and double check what your budget is and begin that preliminary process of setting a baseline budget throughout the construction project. For the next 0 to 15 months, you're going to be in the pre-construction phase. So at that time, we move on into assembling a feasibility study. So once you have kind of the budget set and the programs from the architect, we go in the feasibility study. This is where we work with your team and understand exactly what you can spend. Actually, we want to talk a little bit about site now, right? So I'm sorry.
Yeah, so let me just back up one quick second to the step 3, right? Step 3 is when, that may have been relatable because the previous slide where Tom and myself and Jeremy were talking about that construction management at risk, right, where we onboard those 3 team members early. Even the slide is somewhat representative of that. That's exactly what this is. And the reason for us doing that at this point is to really, so we would have the contractor there with our expertise, the owner there to share their vision, and the architect to help interpret that vision. And it's important to know, at this point, we're actually starting to spend a little bit of money, okay? I think Tom even referenced it in our previous slide about the expenditure over time, right? There's a certain rule of thumb is about 10% of the overall cost of the development would be for design services. So we're starting to really spend that right now. King of Glory, for what it's worth, and the last phase, called us as the contractor first before they called anyone else. And we started working with them just on literally a napkin sketch to understand what their vision was. Our industry, because we are so, I would say, have some expertise in construction cost, we're able, particularly on the building side, to apply square foot values, right? That most people understand that our industry relates to square foot values. For on the building side of a classroom, we can, within a pretty reasonable degree of or margin of error, assign a reasonable budget to literally napkin sketch. Now, I would not literally take that to the bank, but again, it's a good tool. It's good to have that information as we're starting to work with the lending agencies. Well, the next step number 4, as Billy referenced, was the feasibility study. Now, the feasibility study is really a term for a process, right? It's a fairly complex process, and we've tried to illustrate that here on the screen. And let me just allow me to try to narrate what this illustration really is trying to do. You see on the very far, depending on how you look at it, left or right, the A, B, C, and D. Each one of those are complex actions that need to take place to support where you see the big blue box that says development pro forma. The development pro forma, at its simplest form, is a financial document that essentially lists every single cost that the church may experience during the development process and the construction process. It's interesting to know, a little tidbit, but our industry would say that 75% of the cost associated with that development performer, right, is construction related. It's the site work, it's the building work, it's the contractor's fees, all that stuff. The other 25% is what we call soft cost, right? And Jeremy referenced some of this a few moments ago. Architecture fees, FF&E, furniture, fixtures, and equipment. It's the things that we have in here that we're sitting on and using, and a wide variety of other things. There literally can be hundreds of line items in a construction pro forma. Well, that document is the key and central document, and it needs to go to the financial institution, right? That's the document that actually validates and says, hey, this is our overall need from a funding standpoint. Again, we're about, right, out of 7 steps, we're on step 3, or excuse me, step 4. So we're about halfway through the process. Again, we're not locking into rates and we're not locking into signing contracts with the bank, but we're starting to get the banks interested in our process, and there's no better tool than that developer pro forma to do that. I want to touch on one thing, and Billy's going to, one aspect, and it's aspect A, the site analysis. In our industry, the site work, right, is typically the largest subcontracted item of any. It's usually anywhere, it could be upwards of 30% of the overall construction cost. And unfortunately, it's usually the most volatile. When I say volatile, I'll use a description, soils. And if anyone's ever done construction in our area, you know, or you may know that not all soils are created equal, right? Sometimes we find soils that are not structurally sound to place a building on naturally, right? We have to alter those soils. Altering those soils it's an extreme cost, right? And it's not exactly money well spent. It's not going into the things that you can touch and feel and experience, right? It's not going into a sound system that really benefits the congregation. It's in the soils, right? So I say that just to say this is a key and very important step, is to do the analysis on the site work. Having a general contractor there early, particularly for what it's worth, Henderson Incorporated, as well as Dave & Nice Builders, we're a little bit unique in the industry that we have our own capabilities to perform the site work. So we both have built-in expertise there, where most general contractors have to sub that work out and depend on their subcontractors for that level of expertise. So a little bit unique there, and I think it gives us an advantage to help our clients really evaluate and manage what could be the riskiest part of a construction process. Bill, you want to touch on a few more?
Sure. So steps B, C, and D, the budget, obviously the building, as Al mentioned, square foot cost. We can usually take the program, look at square foot costs, understanding the church, what type of church you want to create, and apply some numbers there. Timeline. At that stage, we start going through and understanding the timeline. How long is it going to take to do the design? How long to pre-construction? How long until, to bid the project and complete the project? So that timeline helps set our cost associated with general conditions, our cost, and then our overhead and fees. After that, obviously we have some soft costs. Soft costs are anything from design and engineering fees, FF&E, AV consultants, kitchen consultants, fire alarm consultants, things like that we bring in and understand the overall cost to obviously create this pro forma. Once we get all these numbers together, the church goes forward and tries to obviously get an approval on the pro forma. Onboard. After we get approval to move forward, we onboard. The GC will start bringing in, and the architect will bring in civil engineer to help us with the design process. We'll bring in the structural engineer to understand how the foundation and the structure of the building will be put together. MEP engineers, we start bringing all these consultants and experts, testing agencies for the soil and things like that. And these people help us understand and reconfirm where our budget is to make sure we have the team assembled. And obviously during this period, we can go out to a number of MEP engineers, civil engineers, structural engineers to try to get the best price for the church and the overall budget. Al, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just one thing to add about that. You may be asking, hey, well, back in step 3, you onboarded what you call the core team, right? The architect, the contractor, and the owner started their relationship. Why wouldn't you bring on everyone else at that point? And it's a great question, and you can. The simple answer is you can. But it kind of reminds me of something Tom said in the previous presentation. And it really boils down to being good stewards of your money, right? When those professionals are onboarded, right? Again, we're talking about spending dollars over time. The earlier those professionals are on board, they're going to charge to be a part of that process. So what we're saying here is hopefully pays respect to spending money over time and being prudent about that. In some cases, it may be absolutely necessary to bring the civil engineer on board earlier than this, but from a step-by-step perspective, we think this is the best method and one that is the most cost prudent.
Step 6 is the design process. So this is a process we go from basically the programming of the project, and we get into SD, we call it, schematic design. That brings you to about 25% of your overall design. We start to reevaluate the program, understanding the changes we might have at this stage, and bring the drawings and documents up to that level. At this stage, we might start to engage maybe the county just to understand some of our connections to utilities and things like that. Throughout the schematic design process, the team meets usually bi-weekly and maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks with the church to kind of bring them on board and walk them through the levels of schematic design. After schematic design, which brings you to pretty much the 25% level, we start design development, DD we call that. Design development is further evaluating details, how the wall's going to be put together, where the connections to the utilities, bringing in different consultants on AV, the kitchen, how do we put the hood into the roof and work the kitchen, things like that. Schematic design, once you're complete with schematic design, you're about the 50% design level. So you're really, but between each one of these phases too, schematic design, design development, and eventually design construction documents, you are working with the group and budgeting this. We start to bring in key team subcontractors to help us, that are qualified to help us understand the budget. Because once we get into CD stage, we are in the last 50% to 100% of documents. This is when we're really starting to develop all the details, working with the project team, understanding how we're going to get this thing permitted, working with all the outside consultants, and developing all the details. Once the CD stage is done, we should have a fairly strong handle on what the budget is going to be. This is right before we're going to go out and actually bid to multiple subcontractors, 3 to 5 subcontractors in every trade, to make sure we get the best qualified number pulled together for the group. Al, you want to add a little bit here?
Sure. This illustration may make it seem like each one of these steps are easy and they're kind of maybe even all happen at the same time. That is not the truth. This is probably, the step 6 is probably the lengthiest component of the overall 7-step process. For what it's worth, we do have a very simple bar chart schedule to help maybe visualize this time frame as these steps continue to flow. But I wanted to focus on, you see the word contingency up there and some little bar chart associated with that. So I could probably spend all day talking about contingencies. Does anybody know what I mean when I say contingency from a construction language standpoint?
Explain.
Sir?
Explain.
A contingency, simply put, is the establishment of a fund, dollars, right, set aside for the unknown, what we don't know. Again, I like to say that construction is not like manufacturing, right? Where it's not just stamping widgets out where we can predict every second, right? We're working out in the elements, we're working with people, we're working with, global supply chains. So it, to some extent, is unpredictable. And so we know that, and a good development team will recognize that early and establish a contingency. Sometimes, depending on the contract, depending on the complexity of the project, it could be multiple contingencies. Over to you see the types of contingencies we have there in the little dialogue box. It's not uncommon for a complex project to have up to 3. There's a design contingency, right? The design contingency is also related to those bar charts. Billy just explained the SD, DD, and CD process. And if you think about that over time, at SDs we know very little. DDs we know more. CDs we know pretty much from a design standpoint everything we're going to know about a building. That design contingency will decrease over time. We'll go from maybe even upwards of 20% down to much less over time. So does that make sense to everyone? So at SD, we know little. We compensate for that with a design contingency that's greater than at CD time frame. We also have escalation contingencies, particularly in the last 5 or so years, right? Everything has gone up. Therefore, in the 2021, 2022 time frame, it was going up every day. We couldn't even think about making a prediction on where construction cost was going to land. But it's much more prevalent today after the last 5 years to have a escalation contingency for basically inflation. And then we have a construction contingency. Again, that's probably an extreme to have those 3 on one project. We're talking, multi-million-dollar, complex, multi-year projects for that sort of thing. But every project should have some level of contingency involved with it. Just please know that. It is, it's not a bad thing. Actually, I think it's the unsung hero of the project at its core. Again, I've got these little analogies for everything, right? I think of a contingency as a shock absorber, just like on your vehicle, right? You go over a bump, well, you don't feel it as much because you have a shock absorber. That's what these contingencies are. When we, as professionals, establish a budget early on for you, right? We set, whatever that budget may be, our goal is to never exceed that budget. And we do that through the use of contingencies. Oh, we found underground, whatever it may be, right? Underground utilities. Well, we didn't know that to begin with, but we had that contingency there to absorb it, right? It never affects the bottom line. You never have to go back to your bank and say, we need more money, right? That's the ultimate goal of the contingency.
So once we get through the SD, DDs, and CDs, we have a complete set of documents. This is when we go out to our qualified subcontractors and hit the streets and try to obviously test our budget and make sure that we're on track. We will go out to multiple subcontractors in each trade. So we're talking concrete, steel, masonry, all those items, and get 3 to 5 bids in every trade. We will scope them out, which means we're leveling the bids to make sure they have all the components associated with the project. In the concrete, do they have the rebar? Do they have install? Do they skim the concrete? Do they have it all complete? Are we ready to award this contractor? So we basically rigorously maintain this budget. And at this point in time, this is when we're double checking our original budget and benchmarking it. So we're ready to obviously start the process of building the building for you.
Thank you, Billy. The step 6 continued, right? It is the finale, right? And as Billy said, it's where we do multiple things going into step 7, right? Step 7, you see permits, contracts, and financing, right? So now we have, at the conclusion of step 6, we have established the contractual price. So we spend in this construction administrative time frame sometimes 2, 3, several months. The best case scenario is a very little amount of time to do these things, to get the contracts in place. Not only our contract with the client, but the contract with our subcontractors, to have them start ordering long lead materials. So now those materials are going to be in sequence with the upcoming construction. And then finally, you've heard us talk a lot about financing and working with banks and working with your lending agents. But this is the time frame that you actually want to lock in with your bank, right? So, because now, again, when we have an illustration for this, we spent a good amount of money all the way through, but we're getting ready to arc, right? That the construction is where you're going to spend most of your dollars, right? And it makes sense. So now you definitely need that construction loan in place. I will point out one thing. As I mentioned, we were using King of Glory Classroom Edition as a case study. And I'm pretty pleased to report that when we got to the conclusion, right, through the step 6, when we went out to pricing and so on and so forth, we actually came in under budget, right? So the church actually had excess funds to do as they wished, right? So ultimately, they wound up not using as much as a loan as they were qualified for, which is, that's a home run. From their perspective, from our perspective, and I think it's a testament to the teamwork early on in the process. A couple of times I'd mentioned some illustrations that we have. This slide labeled timeline recap of the development steps, and that's exactly what it is. We just went through 7 key steps to the development process. This readdresses those and simply puts it at a timeline. Earlier on, you heard me mention that King of Glory Classroom was a 15-month development process. Those blue steps, as you can see, stair steps, as you can see there, represent that 15 months. And then the green at the bottom represents that 9 months of construction. So again, is it unusual to spend so much more time in development than you do construction? I would say for smaller projects, yes. It requires practically the same processes and steps and time frame for a large project as it does a small project. But a larger project is certainly going to take longer to construct. We have multi-million-dollar projects that will take 2.5 to 3 years to construct. So I just want to make sure this is general, and it is focused on built on the King of Glory classroom case study. And then second to that, Billy's going to talk about the cash flow projection.
Yes, this slide illustrates the cash flow projections. We call this the S-curve. As you can see, our pre-construction stage is the first 15 months of this approximately. So we're only spending up to about 9%. That's all your soft costs, your design costs, items like that. For the first 15 months, that's your expenditures here. That's about the 25% of the overall project, obviously. Once we hit the construction stage, that's where that S-curve really begins to climb and the church begins to spend more money. And as a team, we're managing that process monthly and working on that S-curve as we bring out the projected timeline of the cost. But as you can see, it really increases. The construction period on this project was only 9 months, but that's you go from roughly 9% of your costs all the way to the 99-100% of your final cost for the construction there.
Yeah, and just a note about that, reading that graph, what it really tells me, right, is we're spending the least amount of money when we're in the planning stages, right? So to me, that is money well spent, because if we don't plan accordingly, construction, for an example, that 9-month project, it could take 12, right? We could run into unrecognized issues in the field, which again is going to cost the church, in this case, more dollars, if nothing else, just through the life of the construction loan. So that the idea is to make the construction process as efficient as possible. That is the most cost-effective thing we can do, and spending time up front when we have the least amount of capital outlay is the best way to do that.
So this last slide is talking about the top 3 takeaways. So once we get through this project, obviously, here's the 3 items we'd like to present to you. Assemble your team early. Get your team so you can pull them together. You trust them. You bring in the resources to create your budget. Align your vision with the dollars that you want to spend. Make sure that you have the right team in place, and then align and work through that vision of how you're going to spend the money there for your church and create this overall beautiful project. And last but not least, delegate and,
So in essence, what this last bullets really indicates is in church organizations do a really nice job of committee-based leadership. Maybe not everyone, but can anybody here with a church organization raise your hand if most of your special projects are led through committee-based, right? It's a very prevalent thing, which is fantastic, right? You need that level of collaboration. You need that level of buy-in. For what it's worth, King of Glory Church, they have a fundamental rule that any major decisions has to be voted on by the congregation, right? So ultimately, the congregation has ultimate authority over what the construction that happened here. But that sort of filters up or down, depending on how you look at it, to the construction committee, right? The construction committee here at King of Glory Church was upwards of 10 folks, right? But those 10 folks designated one leader who was responsible almost solely for helping develop the project. And that's really what we found is a recipe for success on any sort of project that has any level of complexity to it. Have one designated person representing the church that can make, that has the autonomy to make decisions on the church's behalf. It just streamlines things quite a bit, and in our experience, helps the overall process. So with that, Emmanuel, how are we? 5 minutes? I think we're going to be close. So with that, we are going to close our presentations and ask for some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Would you be willing to share the slides?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if you want to take a picture, right, there's my contact information, Billy's contact information. I'll give you my business card. Billy will give you his business card. We'll share this with you. As a matter of fact, I didn't put it on here, but we have a template development performer, going back to one of the slides the document that you use for financing. We'll be happy to share that with you as well. So please just email us.
Really quickly, not to cut you off there, Al, following presentation, everyone registered, we have email addresses. What we'll do is we'll put together a packet, a lot of the information that was shared today, and we're going to send that out to you all, probably, I would say, early next week. So you will, I know a lot of folks take pictures, take notes, encourage you to keep doing that, and we're going to calculate the information. The only panel that will not have PowerPoint will be the financial panel at the end, because they're more doing the interview session. We will share all the information. Still got a couple minutes left.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
When you said 11% of the project cost is design, does that include the architectural cost as well?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Rule of thumb, right? It's dangerous to throw out numbers like this, but these are industry averages that you could look up online or, wherever. But yes, sir. Rule of thumb for your design services, which will be inclusive of the architect. And the way, just real quickly, the way that's structured is typically the architect will have a contractual relationship with the structural engineer, the mechanical, plumbing, electrical engineer, and any other specialty, acoustics, right? Acoustical engineer, often very prevalent in church-type projects. The architect will umbrella that, okay? Those costs will be, let's just use super round numbers, industry numbers of 10% of the overall development cost. The civil engineer, and I'm not sure why this is, right? I didn't make it up, but it's just the way the industry works itself out. The civil engineer usually works directly for in this case, the church, the owners. Their fees would be slightly in addition to that 10%. Typically, again, it's dangerous to throw out numbers, but you could expect 2 to 3% for the civil design. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I have another question. On the funding validation, you mentioned you use a square foot price. Would you be able to tell us on this project for the classrooms, approximately what's the square foot price?
You may notice I specifically did not put numbers associated with the project, right? And that was just out of respect for King of Glory Church. If you have a specific project that you'd like to talk about, we would be happy to share our thoughts on a square foot cost for your project. Yes, ma'am.
You sent this project out for bid, which sounds sort of like a hybrid design bid build versus CBAR.
Yes, ma'am. In the previous slide, you may remember me saying something to the tune of 85 to 90% versus 15 to 20%. 15 to 20% is the cost associated with the contractor, right? That's where you have faith and you negotiate and you bring that contractor in early, right? The majority of the cost, it's the contractor's responsibility to go out to market to subcontractors for the majority of the cost. Yes, ma'am. So that way you are assured that the majority of the project, i.e. let's just use the bigger number, the 80%, is you're receiving fair market value through the competitive bid process with the subcontractor, as well as the vetting of those subcontractors, the pre-qualifications and all that stuff.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.